I'm going to introduce Jan, my dear friend from Krakow, in a very unconventional way, which is to cut straight to the chase and tell you why what he has to say and his work is extremely important. If you've read Carlo Ginzburg's fabulous essay, Clues, Roots of Interpotential Paradigm, which you should read tonight if you haven't read it already, you will know that he traces two fundamental epistemic paradigms from the Paleolithic to the present. It is quite an accomplishment in a few-page essay. What he says is that there are two routes to the way we do things. One originates with the hunter, who reads clues such as pug marks on the ground of the tiger he is in pursuit of or some other animal. The other is binary, that is to count things. And there's evidence from the Paleolithic that people were counting things very, very early. Those two things come together in what Jan does, counting things and following clues. The importance of this, the achievement of this is best summed up for me by the master of this craft, who is alas no longer with us, John Burroughs. And I'll read you one sentence to explain from a good essay of his. We have mounting evidence that work by different authors, work in different genres, work of different eras, work in different national forms of English, can all comprise statistically distinguishable groups. Now that sentence blew my mind when I read it. How is it that one of the most subtle expressions of humanity, namely literary style, can form statistically significant groups? That's the clue that Jan's work endlessly follows. There's no answer at the end of it. There's only the pursuit of that coming together, but never quite reaching the unity of statistical expression. So over to you.
Thank you, Willard. Thank you very much. Of course, there's no way I can live up to the expectations that have been created, but I'll try. I always find as far as am I being heard, am I being seen, or am I not being seen, which is not such a bad thing, and is my screen seen? So whatever happens today, even if all this sucks, at least you'll see some colorful pictures. It won't be a complete waste of time. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm not going to read my horribly long title, also because it's also very misleading. As you will very soon, you have been tricked into something today. So, but I have to first, just to be on the safe side, explain things that perhaps don't need to be explained. Stylometric can be defined very easily, counting things in text to do all kinds of things. We very often count words, frequent words, if we follow Jan Burroughs' great discovery, to do all sorts of attribution. So I can tell you who Elena Ferrante really is. As Domenico Sanone, it's obvious. I know, I counted. And got interviewed by Rayuna. So, and you should have seen their faces. And we also do chronology. But we actually can count anything. Well, I mean, counting dead bodies in literature can give interest, and comparing the number of dead bodies in books can tell us something about genre. If it's two, then it's probably a love story that ended badly, and if there's more, it's probably a war romance or something like that. So whatever you want. Now, this is not very new, as you can see. At least in 1897, since this book was published in London by Vincenty Lutosławski, a crazy Polish Platonist philosopher, who took his Cambridge lectures and created what he called the law of stylistic affinity, which you see here. He used it to propose a new chronology of Plato's which some people still be it isn't really that stupid. Of course, she was not using computers, but of course, it all became very much easier when the computers came around, as you can see. And the people here are members of our stylometric mafia, my very good friends. They came up with a definition of style that fits our dark purposes of counting things as well as looking at style in a more traditional way. And that's interesting because style is probably the best understood and the least defined or definable element of literature. My guru professor, Vita Kabatovska, the cognitive linguist, always says that style is a big shapeless bag that different people throw different things into, and they're very convinced of being right. Another thing that we'll be mentioning today is distant reading, which is uh, termed according to in opposition to close reading, our usual approach to great literature. And of course, the name here is Franco Moretti, who basically understood very early on that we have produced too many texts and now we can't read them all. And but it might be a good idea to actually read this stuff. And so how do we read? I mean, without reading, perhaps. You know how you can get lost in a maze, but when you see it from above, from a distance, you know how to get out? It's a metaphor. I'm not sure it's Moretti's, I think it's mine. Then we have his collaborator, Matt Jokers, who tells us that we simply have to do this as literary scholars because the material is there, because of all those digital editions of text that are growing as we speak. I mean, as we are wasting our time here, somebody is digitizing another book. Of course, there is strong opposition to distant reading, and Joanna Drucker says this. I guess I disagree with her mostly because I'm interested in patterns and the interpretations can wait. And there is my good friend Laura Mandel, who doesn't like the stuff we do with gender and stylometry, but we still talk, so it's okay. And so now the combination of distant reading and stylometry, when we look into this, as we've been looking for the last 12, 15, 20 years, or perhaps even more, we see, I mean, the stylometry is very good at discovering our authors. And I've in a previous lifetime, I used to be a translator of literature, so I'm obviously interested in the traces, in the visibility of the translator, to use Vernuti's phrase. Chronology was very early on, as I've already mentioned, by Lutosławski, and there's other things that we see, but those signals are mixed. Usually authorship is very strong. It all depends what you count and of course the kind of text collection that you're looking at. Now, of course, because the texts are there, or at least almost there, it's obviously I'm not saying big data, although that term is going to appear in a moment. But slightly bigger data might obviously bring us a little more insight, perhaps to help us separate those signals or those mixed signals, or perhaps get at least some insight into their, I don't know, proportions, reciprocal relationships, etc. And then if we combine this with simple semantics that we get out of the text, and with the text metadata, and of course, everybody knows what metadata are, but I'm going to say that it might be the author, the translator, the date of the text, the date of the translation, the sex or the gender of the writer, etc., 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 the place of publication and all that. And of course, the stylometrists are usually very lazy, so they're trying to avoid as much as possible adding extra knowledge information into the text they already have. They're happiest what they're dealing with. with just plain text, because obviously a distance reading approach would quarrel with wasting or spending your time on adding more information. So, okay, and this is where I reveal my cards. So you've been content to coming to a lecture on Polish literature, which is not a subject I suspect is very well known to you. Now, we did invite the Polish ambassador in London, who is also a good colleague of mine and a great specialist in Polish literature, but he's been recalled to Warsaw suddenly, so he had to even blow off Theresa May and us. So I don't know if that makes you. And by the way, you know why he's been recalled to Warsaw? He has to take his medical. Anyway, he would he's also a highly digital humanities skeptic, so he would be there to say, I'm sorry. I also thought Gabriela would be, a little about, Anyway, so why the 10,000 texts in Polish? First of all, we don't have a Google Ngram viewer for Polish. It's just for the big languages. We, in general, because I started this collection of 10,000 texts in Polish as part of the big project I'm doing at my university. Very often, people who gather national corpora or the collection of texts of a given culture miss out on translation. I make sure they are there. Again, it's my literature translator past that, obviously. Also, it's fun to add your stuff into all this. So there are enough indirect sources. The Polish Wikisource project is beautiful. I mean, they're really putting an amazing amount of excellent digitalized stuff. There is the whole primary and secondary high school literary canon is also as a separate entity, so we could use that too. And when worse comes to worse, we can borrow from the bad digitizations of the National Library of Poland, called Polona PL. And then there's the fourth site that I won't even mention by name. And it's a very resilient pirate. Whenever I lost one of my own translations into Polish, this is where I would get them, and then write them an angry letter. And now, just to show you that we're not playing around, of course, the national corpus of the Polish language, you just learned Polish words here, for you. Of course, it's a very different thing it's like the British national corpus. Now, they are based on just 2,500 books, including non-fiction and press. So while we don't have the inner organization and the hierarchy of a linguistic corpus, at least we're building on a large number of cases. Actually, they've already started showing signs that they might now want to join with us, but we'll see. And of course, I have to mention my university's project. My university suddenly discovered they have a digital humanist and actually many more than just me, and they want to do digital humanities as a flagship thing. I enjoy it as long as it lasts, but of course, the main mover in the making of this corpus was COVID-19 and the lockdown, because you are alone with the text. Anyway, so now, of course, the question that is running through your head, so why in Polish? So, because, I mean, obviously, George Sainsbury and Alan of King's College, I learned around lunch today, in the volume he edited it started in the year 1900, Periods of European Literature. As you can see, he has a fairly imperial approach to those minor literatures. Now, obviously, nowadays, I think it's quite fair to say that all literatures except those in English are minor literatures now. But anyway, so this is why not Polish. But then paradoxically, distant reading combined with stylometry might actually make more sense to look at those minor and small literatures. So that might be interesting, but I cannot. I mean, this is all that Sainsbury writes about Polish literature in the volume, about that sake, of later 19th century. And you can see it's one sentence, lonely sentence, and he mentions 5 Polish writers and makes 3 different spelling mistakes. And I'm not going for the Polish diacriticals. So there it is. But then, when you look at good, well-meaning Polish scholars who write English texts about Polish poetry, this is the worst kind of promotion of your main romantic poet you can imagine. I mean, look at this. It's why read this Mickiewicz guy if he is Burke, Goethe, Keats, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Goethe again, and even Alexander Pope. By the way, all those comparisons are full of crap. So actually, that's what you should not do. But perhaps the right way is to do what we seem to have started a couple of weeks ago in Ljubljana, that's Slovenia. You see the difference between Slovenia and Slovakia. Slovenia is better because it borders on Croatia and Austria and Italy, and you can be in each of those nice countries in 45 minutes. Now, so we were there in Ljubljana. Actually, my Romanian colleague and myself had to fight like hell so that they would include us in the small literature category because we're too big for them a little. But you can look at how much stuff was talked about. Defining small literatures by numbers was very interesting. And when you mention exploring social institutional relations in 19th century Slovenian narrative fiction for modern presence, you see that was done on big data. By big data, you mean everything they got. They looked into 19th century realistic novels in Slovenian. All they have is 265. They've digitized them all, and now they have it. If they discover the 266, they're going to digitize it and still have the 100% of the corpus. Because obviously, the numbers in my corpus of 10,000 texts are, well, it seems like a lot. So these are as you can see, sorted by prose and poetry and drama and the originals and the translations. And I'm really showing off with the number of tokens, letters, words. And I have 1,682 authors, 674 translated. I have even more translators. I have 105 authors who are also translators within this corpus, and I have source languages, including Polish, which are 25. Of course, they are very unevenly represented. Okay, now, of course, the representativeness of the 10,000 in proportion to the entire Polish literature is questionable, because obviously the various filters are there, and not necessarily, of course, in this order. And so it was basically a combination of all of that, and of course, a lot of it has been left out, obviously. Let me show how bad, how non-representative. So these are the data for some of the more or less recent years of artistic literature. So love stories, and I think detective fiction doesn't qualify. Probably porn as well. So this is what we get every year in new titles, new translations or new originals. After 5 years, you get 11,000. That's already more than my famous corpus. And by the way, the need for distant reading becomes obvious because those 5 years of work of authors, I mean, if you wanted to read all those books, produced, published in Poland in 5 years as new titles, you would need 30 years if you could read one book per day. So we have a problem here. By the way, do you still remember how in the first decade of this century, Google Books promised to catch up with everything by 2014? And I wasn't even Polish. So let's look at what I have, and let me show you how this metadata thing. Because of course we have the years at the x-axis, and you can see how the proportion of translations in Polish literature has been rising with time. And by the way, the recent proportions between blue and red is very visible in Polish bookstores. You should still go there, but also in internet bookstores as well. So that's how open Polish literary culture is, if you want to look at it that way. Now, of course, as you can see, we'll be dealing mostly with the final years or decades of the 18th century, because the rest is quite the rest is quite small. So that's already an interesting diagram for a historian of literary translation in Poland, and there's a number of things that I have to explain to you why I'm really excited about, and you have to believe me. So you might notice, for instance, that blue is the proportion of translations from the English. And one interesting thing is that according to previous scholarship, the 1930s were the time were the time when English literature started to dominate the translation market in Poland. That's because they weren't looking into much older stuff and a broader selection of genres. So as you can see, the Poles have been reading at least translating English literature well at the beginning of the 19th century, and you will see that when Poles become independent in 1989, that's more than a decade, the main thing they do in reading is they start translating even more English literature. Of course, not making, I mean, I don't think there's any causality, but except that they might have been forbidden. You will notice that the 1940s have a sudden spike in translations from Russian, especially Soviet literature, because that was the time of hardcore Stalinism in Poland. There are some other interesting things. Look at the sudden emergence of translations from the Hungarian. And again, that's an interesting thing. And other things that historians of literature translations have always said was, as a culture starts adapting translating foreign texts, first they do the really old classics, and then the kind of interval between the original and the first translation into that language becomes smaller, and you can see that the red trend line is showing that this is exactly happening. Now again, my traditional translation study scholars in Poland are excited by that, because while they felt that this is what's happening, nobody's presented them with a nice graph and a trend and a trend line. So that's where it comes so far. Okay, let's look at Polish authors by sex in this collection, and I'm using sex again because I think it's simpler because it's binary. So if you think Polish women are underrepresented here since the beginning of the 19th century, they still fare better than foreign female authors translated into Polish. Then there's quite a difference. On the other hand, there it was. On the other hand, the profession of translating is now increasingly dominated by women. which again is not does not always happen in Polish literature, but at least we have a nice material here on. I mean, we got to count it. There may be problems in the 19th century. A lot of bored aristocrats would publish translations anonymously, and of course, who they were in terms of sex agenda. That's another story. Now, in translation, we have four genders. As you might have guessed, men translate women, women translate women, women translate men, men translate women. Now, as you will see, what's really most interesting is that not the raw numbers, but look at the differences in the proportion of translating based on the sex of the original author. The proportionally, men very rarely translate women. And when I look into my own content, and I think of the 30 novels I translated into Polish, only 3 were by women. And I had to do one because she was my late grandmother's favorite author. And then it was Nadine Gordon. And I think I know why why men are scared of translating women. It was scared. Voice, whatever that means, as I was translating that very good novel. Okay, this isn't really funny. You realize that Nora Roberts placed first and J.D. Robb placed fourth is the same person. So it's not Agatha Christie, and that's the problem, I think. Well, thank God for Shakespeare, and then the two French guys. I don't know if you recognize any other names here. Karl May, the German author of adventure novels on the Xena 2 series, incredibly popular in, I'd say, until my time, in fact. Moriotai, the great author of Hungarian historical romances, he's so far he's even beating King and Dickens. How about that? And then something that interests me personally, this guy who translated 42 novels by Balzac also translated the entire Stendhal, almost the entire Proust, and he had time to be a doctor. Madame Curie had probably the same sort of output as a scholar. Some physicists sort of counted the time she must have spent to discover what she discovered. That's about like more or less what the Zelensky boy guy did. Some names you probably don't. I mean, anybody heard of Kurt Mattel and Matthias Land? Interwar German authors of writing pulp fiction. Yeah, anyway. Now, of course, data include places of publication. And here I must sadly say, being from Krakow, Warsaw still wins, the capital city of Poland. But you can see that, actually, I couldn't fit the entire picture here, but imagine London is there too, and even Edinburgh and Rome. Well, we have a tiny little Vienna, and there's even Jerusalem. So apparently people, Leipzig is much less of a surprise. Now, and surreptitiously, I'm now taking you inside the text because using the same Google Maps API, even a monkey can do places in the text. So, and again, proportions, so you can see that while Warsaw and Krakow are really important in Polish literature, so is Paris and Rome and Moscow, London not so much. And when you move into German text, of course it moves west again. But then look at how important Paris and Rome are for are in German literature, much more so than Vienna. That's a little surprising. London first better, and then in English text, it's London, and I have no idea what Brno is doing. Now, it's just the historical capital of Moravia, and in my opinion, this is more or less where the good white wine starts as you travel from the northern countries like Poland and white. Now, it might be an artifact of something. I'll see. Anyway, uh, and then of course, if you apply more advanced stuff to such a big collection of text and use happily have access to a huge cluster of mainframe computers that my university shares with other universities in Krakow, you can actually use a pre-trained large language model by a young student who, for the hell of it, trained sentiment analysis, the discovery of positive and negative feeling in text on literary material, which is not something which is often done. And thanks to this, I could draw a trend line. In blue is the amount of positive feeling, to simplify things extremely, in foreign translated literature, and look at that dip in the middle of the 19th century in Polish literature, which coincides with one of its major historical catastrophes. But then we have, I mean, what comes down has to come up. And here, this rising of positivity coincides with late 19th century realism, which for a number of various reasons carries the Polish name of positivism. I mean, that's actually a high school handbook of literature. And suddenly this positivism acquires a totally different meaning than by my eminent colleague from my university, Tadeusz Wojnicki. So right now we're already within the text. But of course, when stylometrists want to deal with text, they need more statistics. And to get more statistics, thank God we had this guy. He's already been mentioned. This is John Burroughs, surrounded by people who treat him as gurus, Alexis Antonia, the bald fat guy from Poland, and Hugh Craig, and of course Ray Stevens, because he's along with the picture. So there it is. And John Burroughs thought that most frequent words, the ones we usually don't see, like and it and in and at, are somehow they give us a lot of information about text, including authorship, but not just that. So so using Burroughs's method with some additions, and using a piece of software that Maciej Eder wrote with Mike Testamont, and they even let me do a little, but I suck, so a little. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take all those 10,005 tenets, treat them as a bag of words. That is, I'm going to destroy the whole concept, but I'll just be counting words. I'll come up with the most frequent word list and use from 100 to 2,000 of those most frequent words, count the occurrence of those most frequent words in each text, and calculate a distance measure. In other words, calculate the degree of similarity or difference between the texts. And there's all kinds of nice ways to present that. So if you really want to all your audience, and this is what I do to my students. Now, this is not really useful in terms of analysis until, of course, we found a way to fill this room with those things and touch these. And I can see that you touch that and the text falls out or something. Mm. But you can sort of see that there are fragments of this thing where colors stick together. I mean, this light pink sort of happens to be most of them in one place, and then the orange stuff. You see Shakespeare down there, the dark blue right here, and all that. So it looks like things that come from more or less the same time, but also a different original language, tend to stick in one place when we just do this objectively simple thing of counting the proportions of the most frequent words. And sometimes I still think it's magic. So let's drop this. So we have to. I mean, it's a little easier to discuss that when we squeeze that to 2 dimensions instead of three. This network, because that's what it is, sort of is a little too much like the map of Russia for my liking, but I'll try to forget this. And so let me explain what we see here. Old Polish literature, which is in dark green, seems to sit around here, and then from then on, the various half centuries tends to evolve from bottom left to top right. Of course, it doesn't matter whether it's top or bottom or left or right, but there is an evolution. And come on, it's understandable. I mean, even though this information we're getting this effect just from the proportions of the most frequent words. It's understandable. The proportions of those must have changed with the change of language, so that would make sense. But the fact that the same sort of thing puts drama in one corner up here. Uh, okay, different pronouns in dialogic text. Oh, by the way, this is how we spell Shakespeare. And but then, and that's a little weirder, the translations from different languages start to sort of cluster in their own places on that diagram. And that is suggested. Barbara, how much more time are you going to spend? We said an hour. Oh, cool, excellent. Yeah. So okay. I think I'll get through everything. Now, before we say, Jan, you're telling this beautiful story and you're mesmerizing us with. Now, there's one simple way of checking whether those network weights or degrees of similarity really work. If this comparison matrix shows what I'm telling you it shows, we should have a darker diagonal line here, showing that some of the strongest similarities are between texts either written in original in the same half century or translated from the same from the same from the same language. Some exceptions prove the rule nicely. The affinity, the very strong similarity between text translated from the Czech and those written in the latter half of the 15th century, 1400 something. This is when the Polish language was under strong Czech influence. So that checks out. This is what I did here. Right? That was cheap. So again, you've seen this already, but see now when you just color the originals and translations, how different translations are from the originals. Of course, there is some overlap, but really, I mean, this Iberia here is really just almost pure translations. And we can once again identify those spots. And it gets better. And again, you have to take my word for it, but let's take a look at this corner. So this is Shakespeare, now spelled in your old-fashioned way. The pink stuff here at the bottom, that's fire. Now, every secondary school student in Poland, who of course is paying attention to his Polish literature teacher, knows that the mixture of Shakespeare and Byron gives rise to Polish Romanticism, and they're right there, right in between. Plus also antique drama, and which is up here. So it's almost too good to be true. Now, very quickly, some of major Polish writers. So the 19th century, with the first Nobel Prize winner we had, 1905, Henryk Sienkiewicz, his violet stuff is all over the place because he writes in very varied styles. There's a lot of archaization in his romances from set in the 17th century, where he recreates an old Polish way of speaking, and there's his International Quo Vadis, which is nicely modeled after translations of traditional Polish translations of Latin texts. And then there are his novels of manners set in his time. Then Proust and Orzeszkowa, that makes two more realistic writers, former friends and then enemies of Sienkiewicz. They concentrate very much on the social novel, and they are very often mentioned in the same breath in the history of Polish literature, as are Raymond, our second Nobel Prize winner, 1924, I think, and Żeromski, again the same generation. Then we have some Polish drama by Zapolska, the actress, dramatist, and novelist, and Mrożek, much more recent. Now our leading living writers include Tokarczuk, the Nobel Prize winner from a couple of years ago, and the other three are very much their satellites. But if you meet any of those three, you haven't heard it from me. And then there's lighter stuff. Dukaj, the alternative history novelist, and Sapkowski, the creator of the Witcher series. And now for some translated stuff. Look how Zelensky's quasi-monopoly on Balzac shows up in Balzac being the closest, the densest cluster of, as you say, in the network analysis sub-community. Dumas has been translated by a number of anonymous writers, as was Dickens. Conrad, of course, had to be translated into Polish, paradoxically. And Austen comes here to the right, gravitating toward more modern writers, but that's because she was only translated, apart from Sense and Sensibility in 1936, and that's late, she was only translated after 1956 into Polish, and also most of that is by the same translator. So we don't only see the signal of the original language, but also of the translator as well. And that's scary, especially to someone like me, who used to be one. Now, just to finish you off, actually, I have a clock here, so I know. So now, if we look at more meaningful words, but of course, you need to have a nice statistic, so colors look like something you might want to do. We can now divide text into very colorful, little colorful, somehow very low, high, very high is much better. So I'm going to stick with that. And when we apply this to the map or network created with the most frequent words, we get interesting stuff. So red, by the way, doesn't mean red as the main color of the book. This just means a lot of colors. And there is one corner that has a lot of colors. It's this one. Remember that. Okay, and this really makes me feel weird. You might remember, this is Shakespeare. Isn't it weird to say that there's not a lot of something in Shakespeare? On the other hand, of course, it sort of makes sense that Shakespeare doesn't really need to describe the colors of his characters or actors, because you see they're in red or white or whatever. So perhaps that's for who's just discovered that drama is less colorful than anything else. You see, that makes sense, but I never thought about that. I don't know about you, Persis. I haven't thought about that because I'm stupid and I'm unnecessarily excited. Oh, and there's love. So once again, now a lot of love, relationships, family, words, and see what happens. Now that's quite more, a little more uniformly spread, but once again, the same corner is has a particularly large proportion of those texts associated with love. And now we know the poetry is colors plus love. Okay, so what? That's the difficult part. It looks like I've got something here. I, for much of, I mean, mostly I don't know what I have here. I'm clutching at straws, as you can see. I don't think we're fooled by my absolute assurance in what I was saying. I mean, it's still, we're still at the beginning of, I mean, Miller told you that. Now, the results are consistent with earlier observations for smaller data. I've been doing this, I've been growing this collection of text for a couple of years at least. And there's, as you could see, there's quite a lot of corroboration, if that's the word, between traditional literary history and this, whatever this is. And then when what we see does not agree with traditional literary history, well, so much does, perhaps that's an indication we should look at this another time. Why is this book here? What's going on? I mean, why not? And then again, in my private interest, such a strong indication of the existence of translation is that translation scholars have been discussing for quite some time now, especially after the cultural turn in translation studies, that it actually, look how happy Itamar Ibn Zohar seems to be when my diagrams could at least serve as symbolic representations of his polysystemic theory of translation. And again, after you're seeing these things for me here, I'm really, really trying to find an existing theory of language and literature and translation and everything that would somehow explain all that. And I'm done. That's over.
Yes, well, so what do you do with the anomalies?
Well, my dream is get my traditional literary scholars friends to look at them in a slightly broader context. Because when I did that to various anomalies that happen in translation, I got interesting insights. So there is, I have a dream that this distant reading stylometrics would have an office in a big literary department. And they would, and the artists, the great minds in the literary department would come to him to a medical lab. And your doctor doesn't really want to talk to you before you sample and stuff. So be the guy doing the reading samples for some new study into a new collection of texts. If I die having achieved this, you don't think this is a good advice. So yeah, that's what I'm looking for. That the anomalies. Yeah. There's a number of different anomalies. There are novels that are suspiciously close to drama. Novels that I of course haven't read because I'm doing distant reading so far, but from distant reading to another of our friends, David Hoover, always said that he was one of our of the usual suspects, but he would always tell us that if we don't return to the text from distance reading and stylometry, we're not really doing anything important. So we are certainly not, but we okay, I should speak to people. So I'm certainly not seeing myself taking over. Nobody has to use distance reading to read stuff. I just think it might serve as a beginning of interesting collaborations to close country borders and getting a beautiful friendship. So,
you consider or tried including into your network model generate texts from LLM generative LLMs?
I haven't. The first person to jump on the bandwagon is Timo Levebar, a good friend of mine. So look him up. I looked at machine translation more than 10 years ago, and in how well it, and not how well, how humanely or not it can translate literature. And so while Google Translate 10 or more years ago had its very own style, which meant it was doing things that are bad. Now, DeepL and the present version of Google Translate, you can no longer tell the machine from human translators using just most frequent word style. That is cool. Did my topic about 50 French novels translated into English by human systems, and they were all slowly, you couldn't tell. But if you use time warping clustering and using a method like that to compare the length of words or the rhythm of the change of the sentence length. Like I was taught this method by a meteorologist. That's exactly the same thing. So for each day, the number of users, and he uses this time series approach. And here it's very easy. Machine translation doesn't spur around the joining and cooking sentences. The human translators are usually very talented to no, this is too long for the mic. Or the other way around. So as a result, when you compare those kind of theories approaches, there you can easily tell. Okay, so half a year ago, you could quite easily tell that you could see that the text written by translated by the machine are much closer to the original. But of course, there are great things about it, but we'll think of something. So,
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Is there a question coming? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering about the start of this what you mentioned. I was wondering during when you saw these like the counts of love versus love thing. Is it you count the mentions of love, or do you is it proportional words?
Well, there's an arbitrary list of words I came up with. Polish is a highly flexive language, so you need to lemmatize them in order to make things easier for the poor computer. And you just count them, and then I simply used quartiles to have those 4 different categories, because otherwise the absolute differences were very insignificant because of the low statistics.
Okay, so it's standardized by the
Yeah. Oh yeah, every time. Yeah.
this language. You think there's a problem because we can't read all texts in most languages. That strikes me as prejudicing the game on the outset.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I cannot swim in all of what I can swim at all. I can't swim in the Pacific Ocean, all of it. But I can splash on the beach and I can have great fun. And I can understand swimming in an ocean that way.
And it will be more
even more so with my experience of language is an experience of something that you could say from the beginning is whole, at least within a large historical period, that people are dealing with much the same thing, that there are no catastrophic breaks. In general, that the language has an integrity of its own through time. So an experience of Shakespeare can propagate out into other forms of language. Of course, it gets complex with English because there are many Englishes.
Oh,
and there are many strong cultural influences on what seems to be maybe the same language. But it's a far more complex situation. Now, if you were at Northrop Frye, a name which maybe is not recognizable anymore, I don't know.
I showed him around Krakow once when I was a student. I was only more scared that when I did that to Malcolm Bradbury, because he kept on writing those stories about funny Eastern Europeans and
that notion that the mind can expand into a language from a smaller experience of it. Northrop Frye's experience of English wasn't terribly small. Mine is much smaller, but there is an organic, growing unity of the language, which tempts me to argue that with counting words and applying statistical techniques, we're looking from a very different perspective on the same body of material. And this goes back to my first question, we can hunger for the patterns that we see. Yeah. And there is a great temptation to let everything else drop out. Look at this corner. Look at this corner.
Yes, but then there's the other kind of people who don't believe it's all fractal. That you take some of it and you reproduce it, and that it sort of covers the same pattern. And now we are at this. We have the opportunity to look at everything. I mean, the example of Jonathan Hope comes when he and his colleagues produced this corpus of early modern English, and they discovered that all the words allegedly brought into English literature by Shakespeare have already been used 50 years previously and 100 years previously. I mean, before I frightened my conservative English studies conference in Krakow with you 3 or 6 years previously, I frightened them with Hugh Craig and Jonathan. And you should have seen our conservative Shakespeareologists from all over Poland hearing and seeing that it's all a mystification of great proportions, probably performed by the Oxford English dictionaries, because they and actually this is how Jonathan explains that when they found something in Shakespeare, they weren't looking for anything new. So people like me, and I mean, genetically, I'm in the family that already has 3 generations of elementary particle physics. I was running away from the family business into counting words with computers. That's sad. But I mean, they want to see it all. I want to see it. I want to make sure that, for instance, I would like to see the canon being representative, but perhaps it's not. And the tiny window that we have, and again, there is a filter for the canon. So while I'd like the truth to be what you say, I'm a little afraid that without checking, I mean, statistics itself, I mean, mainstream statistics, not linguistic statistics, has been changed completely by applying the big data approaches to everything. And the number of theorems they had in pre-computational statistics either were proven as obvious as axioms or simply were not confirmed. And I'm sort of hoping that literary study will live one day to see it all, or almost all. But then again, I showed you what 10,000 texts really means, even in a minor literature like Polish. It's not a small literature, but of course it's minor. It's just a 5-year production thing nowadays.
Yeah, it seems to me that there are questions that you can ask, as Jonathan illustrates, where we come up with answers that have much greater precision. We're not on something like the
absolutely, yeah.
And I wonder what scope has occurred to you, and what you describe as translation work. Fascinating. It's almost like you were looking for reinforcements of traditional literary history rather than actually.
Yep.
Whereas the sort of work that Jonathan and the people at Folger have been doing has been very much questioning some of those traditional literary assumptions. And I'm surprised you don't want to. You've already obviously done it with the translation.
So I think it's the difference between, say, what Jonathan does and what people like me do is, I think it's a question of the degree. Some of us are very much attached to traditional literary theory and scholarship, and some of us want to go and discover new stuff. But my conservative feeling is that there is a lot of agreement potentially between the quantitative and the qualitative. But then, of course, whenever they disagree, perhaps there is space for careful modification and evolution.
There's still also a validity in being able to say with precision what we thought always else talk about it, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's technologically also very valuable.
Yeah. I'm quite happy with what I see in translation, because this is where we see, I mean, for instance, when you take a number of translations of, say, a couple of authors into another language, they tend to group by the original author, even though we're counting the words in the translation. And that's not something I ever expected as a translator. Worse, I've noticed that some translators can achieve different voices for different authors. Sadly, I'm not one of them. I have very unpleasant looking graphs, which compare my translations with those by other people, and perhaps that's why I no longer translate at all. That's not very constructive.
No, I think already at this stage with the data that you've got, what you're saying about translation is very interesting and valuable. So because translation obviously so important to
and then there is the next thing. After all, when we dig so deeply in such a way into literary text, at one point, sooner or later, it will be the responsibility of the artists, of the writers, to come and think with us so that we can see. I mean, this is why we were so excited to looking for the real Elena Ferrante in Italian literature. But the real culprits or culprit are highly uninterested in explaining how exactly you write with as two different people of different gender. And I'm not really interested who that Elena Ferrante really is, this guy Domenico Stannone, or perhaps also his wife. But I would be really interested if they sat together with us and we could gather some insight into the actual writing process on the level of language, or even, and that's another of my dreams, take 100 authors and or translators, put electrodes in their brains and make them write about something and look at the EEGs and other stuff. I have a physicist colleague who's actually preparing an experiment like that at my university.
We did a with an audience watching. Watching
yeah, there we go. Even that.
Like yours, it didn't actually produce very.
Yeah, the problem, of course, this might be a sorry again. This might be a pipe dream. Neurologists have told me that our brains are built. I mean, 1/3 EEGs is abnormal because our brains are built like on a haphazard 3D printer or something. It's not that we have all the same centers of something in the same places connected with the same synapses. So, but I mean, we have to try. This is very basic study. It's just as fundamental research, what we all do in literature and in cultural studies, quantitative and qualitative, is just as fundamental as elementary particle physics is. Except, of course, they get all the billions for the accelerators, and we get, well, sometimes we have a big TV screen, so we should be happy.
We are cheap dating.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we shouldn't be.
Maybe it's better than cheap dating.
Right.
I mean, they have to have the billions of pounds.
Yeah, think about the accounting.
Their experiments.
Yeah.
The experience of being a physicist needs to be part of a large group.
Yeah, 200 co-authors.
To do research sitting at home.
Yeah.
Not as important.
I know.
Could we get back to Shakespeare for a moment?
The Shakespeare versus Polish poetry, or Shakespeare being the uncolorful one.
The source of the canon exposed as not, or whatever that argument was about words.
Oh, wait. Oh, right back to Jokers.
I don't think so, but they discovering that Shakespeare wasn't the first.
Oh, that, yeah.
These words, okay, that's fine. But if you read English literature from, let's say, the middle of the 16th century on, chronologically, as I did in preparing for my doctoral examination, it's like the experience of walking up to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. There's nothing, and then all of a sudden there's a mile deep.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah,
at your feet.
Yeah.
So that raises the question: what's going on with Shakespeare? Not that he was imprinting the language with all these new words, but that there's something else going on. And what I'm really talking about is the use of these counting mechanisms to redirect attention to a different and perhaps deeper aspect of a problem than realized. It's not
absolutely.
You can't explain Shakespeare away by the number of new words. But there's something about the bringing together of certain words, and that leads to all kinds of
and I see depths below what we're treading on that are huge.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where it's all going.
If you did, you point to
it, of course. And we would all agree with each other.
have a question about periodization. So I just think I tend to do linguistic analysis, language change, particular semantic change, and then people who it's kind of like to split your democracy into 6 intervals. And yeah, you were showing centuries, and you play around with different sizes of intervals or even overlapping intervals. Have you thought of ways to divide the intervals in a way that is more data driven? I'm struggling.
Not yet, but already, and that's again, and that's again another good reason to introduce translation. Translation scholars have found in the traditional way that translations first made in a given decade, year or something, are usually much more conservative than especially canonical original writings, because the original canonical writings became canonical because they introduce a new quality, a new literary language, while the translators are still traditional. Very often they are not as good writers as the real writers, I'm sorry to say. And then again, Venuti, the translator's invisibility myth, which leads to a sort of a forced domestication of translated texts. And here it would be interesting to measure at which point, say, does a canonical text in the original impact on the language of translations done within the same culture? So that's the kind of thing I see somehow marginally possible. All periodization is a problem, which is why but the most frequent word map has no periodization. The computer doesn't know. It's just, I can mark the colors and then look where most of the color is focused. But of course they overlap each other because the chronology isn't everything. Similarities between authors come into that, and again, more and more signals, as I call them, come into this. So it is a very chaotic, physics-like situation where we're throwing more data at any problem seems at least something we should try, as long as the texts keep on coming.
Yeah, so an appeal of the technique described is the simplicity of the
Absolutely, yeah.
You're looking at. Although the statistical part is complicated. But do you see that as a positive advantage, or is it something that if you had a billion pounds, you would go ahead and linguistically annotate all the text? Any other of the innumerable kinds of things?
Oh, yeah, the semantic annotation would be beautiful, but of course we would need billions of pounds and which would have to be, most of it would have to be spent on training conscientious co-workers in building a huge building to house them.
And Chris jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Yeah. So absolutely, yes. So as I said, stylometries are lazy is my way of saying this is what we can do at our levels of funding and at our levels of collaboration. But if we get to talk to the politicians and persuade them, which is why when we did the big annual Digital Humanities Conference in Krakow in 2016, which you missed, our keynote speaker was Professor Zalewska, who was the first woman to be the head of CERN's scientific council, and she told us that that she sees the same potential of discovering fundamentals. She, 100% physicist, and that the only thing we need to do is to combine the visionaries with the politicians and the administrators, and convince those politicians that we're just as important as, sending invisible particles under Lake Geneva and then under Jura and back again. And now what CERN did for humanity was to invent the internet. And also by chance, almost equally by chance, the things they used to line the accelerator chambers is very good for solar batteries. But that was a fluke. Now imagine the kind of fun stuff we humanists could do if they gave us all the money to play with. But we should probably build something in a space, because otherwise the politicians would say, eh.
But another perspective from physics would be that physicists like a simple model because it shows that you've understood the main thing. So would you say that this is a model that shows the main thing, or is it simply?
And then the devil lies in the details, of course. Yeah, and then we can, once we have a model that shows the traditional model, then we can look at quantum stuff. Then we can look for perhaps the grand unification that later became string theory and all that. So, but we're late. I mean, we're coming late to this table, but
I want to ask if there are any questions online.
So we're through the echo.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Thank you.
It's interesting to me that the whole stylometrics thing, especially kind of break it in terms of style and kind of what we can learn about this.
I have not said that. I was very careful not to say the style of something.
Well, I wonder if you want to maybe elaborate then on that distinction. So why were you avoiding this notion of style?
Because
what then
every person in this room will probably give a slightly different definition. Does style include meaning? Does style include content? I mean, normally we would say style is how we write, not what we write, but that's an oversimplification. So while we call this, I mean, when I compare a couple of authors, I try to make sure I always say the stylometry of Byron rather than the style of Byron, because I'm not sure yet. I'm actually doing style. I prefer to err on the side of caution.
We prefer to say it's more closely related to computational steps.
Yeah, I like that. I'll try to understand. I'll try to sleep on that. But that sounds very nice. Yes. After all, Alan Liu did say that our diagrams are a form of art, so that's at least a good reason to do this thing.
There's so many terms like which we use all the time effectively, and we manage to create some kind of agreement. Isn't it better to think of not definition is the point, but definition is a way to start understanding how stretchable the term is.
I'd agree. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if you think
like
critically about almost any subject, you end up, at least mentally, putting almost every word into quotation marks.
Yeah.
Saying, I don't really mean this. This is sort of the beginning, or this is a peculiar use of something which is much larger.
So I should be more courageous.
Yeah, unfortunately, when it's
Perhaps.
I have a question. Burroughs, one of the ideas that was fascinated him was what he called the predominance of weak markers.
Oh, yeah.
What do you do? What have you done with the puzzle that leaves us with?
I have been very careful because, so weak markers are criteria by which you compare, in this case, text, which usually show us the right thing, but perhaps the statistics is not very reliable, or there are some sort of gray areas. It's not all black and white. Now, Barrow's idea was not to worry about the fact that, say, our most frequent word proportions not always show you who wrote a given book, but add another criteria that would somehow make those results more in focus, and then combine. So say you get all kinds of different medical analyses there. One points a little to this and another to that, but when you combine them together, your doctor knows what's going on. So that was what the problem is, of course, and people around me are doing that. And I, of course, the problem is that how strong a given marker is. What do we trust more? So that is a problem that we have. I mean, the evidence of the sentence lengths with the evidence of most frequent word proportions with the evidence of I don't know, chapter lengths or whatever it is that we might think about the grammatical setup. Very often people combine not just unlemmatized words, but say they count, instead of words, they count grammatical part of speech tags using, of course, in distant reading, automatic tagging, which works in some languages a little better than in some things. But that is the problem with Wigmar. I mean, sadly, Burroughs did not live to see the realization of his dream, I think. So, yeah.
Well, we would have had to live forever.
He still lived long enough. The picture I showed you of him and myself and Hugh Craig and Alexis Antonia and Ray Siemens was taken at our first meeting face to face, even though we've corresponded since at least 1996. And I was giving a talk like this one in Newcastle, Australia, and they brought him out of his old people's home so we could meet in person. And he told me that we've met for the first time, but he doesn't think we'll meet again. I said, no, I'll be coming to Newcastle a lot. And 3 weeks later, he was dead at the age of 92, something like that. So I'll trade that with him. Ending on a tribute to Burroughs is the best way to end this stuff. I mean, I'm sorry to you guys on the other side of my camera that I've been ignoring you for so long, but you could have come.
Thank you so much, Jan. I just switched on my sound to say bye to everyone. This is the last seminar for this year, but I'll see you next year and for our seminars. And yeah, we can continue the conversation here. Bye-bye.
Okay, so